So would you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the project?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Dr. Zoe Harris. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Surrey. And the project that we worked on was called Serious Games for Serious Energy Solutions, Studying Diversity and Collective Decision Making. So the project which we ended up doing was a bit different to what we initially planned. So our initial plans were to use a serious game and to work with local authorities in Bradford, taking that kind of place-based approach.
What's a serious game?
Oh, what's a serious game? Good question. So a serious game is a game that has sort of kind of educational qualities or kind of a more serious theme where you can learn something from it. So our game, for example, I'll go into more detail a bit later, but our game was looking at the effects of climate change on an island. So you have to build a community on the island. You have to make decisions about building houses, harvesting trees, collecting berries, taking coal, for example. And you have to look over time how that affects the state of the island. So it's a serious game in the fact that you're kind of thinking about these consequences that are very real. It's not just kind of for fun and counting, tokens and things.
I see. Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah.
So sorry. So as I was saying, kind of the original plan that we had was looking at working with a serious game that we hadn't yet selected, but working with policymakers in Bradford as we identified that as a place where there's a need. It's a more diverse community. But because of COVID, unfortunately, we had to revise our plan. Several iterations happened. We thought, oh, could we go online? That didn't quite work. The policymakers themselves were just so inundated with just dealing with COVID that kind of our research or our kind of questions became a little less pressing, which is absolutely reasonable. And so what we ended up doing was taking a much more generic approach, looking at more generally how diversity affects decision making.
Yeah. And who did you work with then? Who were the stakeholders that you involved?
So we ended up just working with the general public. We worked with a recruitment agency who put into, we had two groups essentially. We had a homogeneous group, which was made up of people over 40 in managerial roles. And then we had a heterogeneous group, which was made up of a wider range of ages, but not in managerial roles and of a more diverse profile. So our homogeneous group was actually all male as well, all white males, and our heterogeneous group was, I think, at least 75% from ethnic minorities. So we had those two different groups.
Yeah, really, really interesting to see how they work differently.
Yeah.
And what were the most surprising findings from your study?
Well, a lot, to be honest. So I think I think everybody has preconceptions and everybody goes in thinking or go one way or another way. So what we maybe thought would happen would be that the people in managerial positions would work much better together because they're used to working with people, and they'd be much better at decision making because decision making is a big part of your role as a manager. And we just kind of thought that they would work better together. And what we actually found was that our heterogeneous group were much more effective in terms of group cohesion and also decision making. So the way that we looked at that, we had the game is all online, so they had a chat script. They could only communicate via chat, so we could analyze the chat and the language and the types of behaviors we were seeing. And we also had a survey afterwards where we asked them to kind of rank their awareness. And then we also looked at the island. So at the end of the game, you can create a report that shows you over time what decisions are being made. So how much coal are they using? How much forest are they cutting down? How much are they investing in personal wealth or community wealth? And yeah, as I say, what we found is that our heterogeneous group worked much better together. They had much more open discourse. They spoke about collective action taking, because you in your role you have like your action points. So each turn you can do a set number of things, and you also have your own money. So you can choose to invest in a community centre, for example, and that increases kind of the community wellness. So they were kind of talking a lot more about collective action. So, let's protect our community centre this time round, and that means everybody has to chip in. They also had a much higher well-being in the island, as I said. Our homogeneous and heterogeneous, I get very confused with, so I have to keep looking at my notes.
Yeah.
So the in the homogeneous group, they ended up with much higher personal wealth, which indicates to us that they were taking more selfish actions, and they had more natural disasters because they weren't managing the kind of collective resources. People were kind of working on their own. The other really interesting thing was the way in which they kind of spoke to each other. So the heterogeneous groups, or diverse group, they were much more balanced in thinking about conservation and development, whereas the homogeneous group were just thinking about development. And the way that they would approach that was very kind of passive aggressive, and they'd use humour. So instead of saying, oh, actually, you're building a lot of your own buildings, you're protecting your own rooms, you're building a swimming pool, and maybe we should think about doing this differently. They'd make a joke about, like, oh, he's really rich, isn't he? Or he's all right because he's got his pool to keep him safe. There wasn't that direct conversation, which was just so surprising for me. Because as I say, being managers, you would have thought that having those kind of direct, maybe uncomfortable conversations would be more natural, but instead it was very much kind of humour and kind of passive aggressive comments with that glean of, little zing.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. The absence of dissent, or the suppression of dissent, or in a way, really, isn't it?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
If you work with members of the public, so if you were to run it again, which kind of stakeholders do you think would be interesting to do this with, and how would you do that?
Yeah, so I think that we would like to work with policymakers, because I think that the results are really enlightening to kind of check your own bias and also assess how you work with others. So I would really like to get this into a policy space to kind of bring, I think there is an awareness already, but to kind of heighten that awareness of different people are driven by different values and different needs, and accommodating that in a policy setting is really important. And this all came out of this research project, and the kind of bigger research that I'm interested in all came out of when I was working in government. So I worked in DEFRA, I worked in BEIS, and I worked in DFT. And my experience in those places, and it might be different now, is that the kind of decision making is done by a very well educated class of kind of white males. And just through conversations I was having, there really wasn't a kind of worldliness to their understanding. So these people were making policy without kind of seeing how the other side live. They might grow up and they might be able to turn their heating on, no problem. You don't even think about it, just turn the dial up. Whereas there are people who are on a meter, and I think every single degree matters. The moment you turn it on, you're losing money. So the desire for this work came out of this acknowledgement that in order to decarbonise generally in the UK, we have to have a suite of options that work for everybody, and we have to have that kind of just transition. So I think I would like to work with policymakers generally to kind of heighten that, to say, well, look, people with different experiences have lots to bring, and that changes their perspective. Having different views in a room, it increases innovation, like undoubtedly. The literature says it, we found it, and I think that's an important thing to think about. Having like-minded people doesn't necessarily get you the best answers.
So would you say then that just by introducing more diversity in the teams who are making the decision, it changes the decision-making process, but also the outcome of the decisions?
Yeah, exactly. And there's been lots of work, not lots of, there's a body of literature that basically shows when you have a more diverse set of minds, be that kind of protected characteristics, background, education, even discipline in terms of research, you end up with higher levels of innovation, with more innovative outcomes that offer more options.
That's really interesting. And I've just been reading the IPCC report again, and some of the things that really struck me were that they call for a just transition, social and an orientation towards social justice, not just because it's morally right, but also because it can make new ways of living more politically acceptable. And they also say that between 40 and 70% of change could come from social change. And so how important do you think it is to to change the decision-making process and the decisions?
I think it's massively important. And I think from my perspective, the kind of other research I do is all about energy and land. We have a lot of answers. We understand what happens when you add fertilizer, you get emissions. Less fertilizer, less emissions. We understand kind of the empirical science behind it. The problem we have is that behaviour change. So in my view, like 90% of it is changing people's behaviour, and also that idea that every time you make a choice, you're sort of spending a vote on something. So every time, for example, you choose to eat meat, you are voting for potentially deforestation in the Amazon. Whereas every time you choose to take the bus instead of taking the car, you're putting a vote in for more investment in public transport because there's more of a need. You're lowering your carbon emissions. So I think that behaviour change is essential, but that can't come without policy, because if there's not an incentive for people in their lives to make that change, it's really hard. And I think you have there are people who are just interested and want to make a difference and want to kind of live a cleaner life, a greener life, just because it's important to them. But then there are people who really sustainability is not on the top of their list because they have other priorities. They might have a sick child or someone to care for, or just other things that are more important than sustainability. Thinking about sustainability is a privilege. If you can keep a roof over your house, you can keep it warm. Thinking about sustainability is then an option. But if you can't do the first two things, you can't start thinking about sustainability. So until we are in a position where everybody has the luxury to think about it without having to think about their fundamental, like, basic needs to live, we're not going to get there. So that's where policy comes in, to make it that, as you say, that just transition.
I think that's really fascinating, and it really connects to the societal readiness work that we've been doing in Decarbonate also, because it isn't actually just about choice, it's also about how able are people to do the changes. And when you talk about injecting a bit more worldliness into the decision making, I think that's really interesting in two ways. One, that you have the diversity that brings in the knowledge of, if somebody's on a meter, it's much more difficult for them to think about it. But also in terms of the worldliness of the managers themselves, that they realize, or if we change the process of the decision making, do you think that they would bring in less of the humor and more of an open admittance of how privileged they are in a diverse team, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's I think it can be very sobering to kind of see the other side and have an appreciation, and that works both ways. Like, I don't want to imply that we just need to think about people who are kind of on the kind of the working class or the social line.
No,
of
they
poverty.
have the lowest carbon emissions, don't they?
Exactly. So it's also the other side that well, actually, maybe I got brought up being flown around in private jets, and that's the only life I know. So asking me to fly in a regular plane is crazy. So thinking about the other side in terms of how do you encourage those types of people, the kind of the ultra rich to decarbonate, as you say, they're the ones who are responsible for most emissions. So it's about seeing both of those sides and having that kind of it's the old adage of the carrot versus the stick. You need both in policy. You've got to whack some people with a stick and you've got to bring some people along with a carrot. And as you say, I think having that diversity within that decision making helps get to that point of understanding what's the most appropriate mechanism and how can we make it the least painful for everyone, because expecting someone who has lived that life and has that privilege to change is just as unreasonable as it is to expect someone who is on a lower income to make a difference. That it's just as painful for everybody. So it's about really kind of lessening that pain for everyone, and the justice is across the board. It's not just saying well, you're really rich and you've lived a great life. It's going, okay, well, I know it's good, but maybe just tone it down a little bit and we can see some big savings.